my gosh. That was amazing. So, I don't know, Tay just introduced my first slide, so I don't really know what to say anymore. I don't have a title slide. I'm right here, so I figured you could see me, and that would be good enough for an introduction. But my name is Amanda. I work for Wix, support our low-code platform. But I'm not really talking about code today. I'm talking about something that's actually very deeply important to me, and it is this statement that being a developer is an inherently creative profession. And what I notice about this is I think of it as an attribute that developers just have. But when you hear people talk about developers and creativity, it's usually in relation to creative coding. And that's usually in relation to something that has a visual. And that is creative, but that's not it. We're the back-end developers. Don't they get to be creative? So I think that there's just a language thing. And so we don't think about developers as being creatives. That's more like, that's our musicians. That's our artists, our dancers. We don't think about developers. This is a very serious profession. We're not creatives. But I don't believe that. And I want to change that language because I think that not having that as part of our language and part of our identity is actually hurting us. And it's helping add to our burnout stories. It's helping add to when we become unhappy. And also how our teams and our organizations, our leaders treat us. It would be different, hopefully, if they understood what we needed through the lens of this is a creative profession. So being a developer is an inherently creative profession. And regardless of what that statement makes you feel right now, just like travel with me, 30 minutes or less, and decide what you think at the end. If we look to the research, industry experts agree that being creative is an essential problem-solving skill, vital to succeed in software development. So this is a really strong statement. This is really cool, and it's from researchers, so it's serious, right? It's about problem solving. It's not just about visual output. That creates the creative side of being a developer. And it's vital. It's how we get to that next level. It's how we do really cool things, is the way that we think and approach problems. But other than research, I also interviewed a few developers. So I work as a developer advocate right now. It's been a few years since I've worked on production code. And maybe the way people talk about themselves and think about creativity and think about themselves has changed a little. So I wanted to get some folks currently working to weigh in on this. So one developer I approached, Adam, he was like, oh, I can't even help you with this. I'm not creative. I don't think of myself that way. And he wasn't the only person that kind of responded to me when I approached them, like, hey, I have these questions, help me with my talk here. And they're like, oh, no, I'm not a creative person. I can't help you. I don't do CSS art. And I'm like, well, there's other things. But I get it. Like, when you're a kid, this is what you do, right? This is how you're introduced to the idea of being creative. Also, I asked my aunt for a picture of something that I made as a kid, like some of my art, and this is what she sent. Oh man, okay. All right, I was thinking maybe I couldn't make it as a sculptor, but you guys are making me feel pretty good about it. I like that I carved my name into it very big so you knew it was mine. But this is how we're introduced to the idea of creativity and what is creative. We make things, we play with clay, we learn about paint, we draw on the walls or things that we shouldn't do. We're introduced to dance and music. And when I was a kid, you didn't get introduced to code. I'm old enough that we had a typing class, but we didn't really talk about coding. But even, I look at my friends who have kids today, and even when they're starting to be introduced to code, it's not through this lens of being creative. And it's more like a skill you need to have, like learning math and sciences and all that stuff. It's a serious thing. And I think it's important that we start to reframe that because we're all burnt out, or at least we've experienced it at some point. This particular graphic is from the JetBrains State of the Developer Survey, and I picked this graphic because that graphic is comprised of over 26,000 responses to their survey, so that's a lot of yeses to that question. And that's not cool. Did we just pick professions to suffer? That's crazy. We shouldn't all be that burnt out. It should be more rare. And there's a lot of, burnout's a complicated topic, it's very personal, but I don't hear a lot of people talk about creative satisfaction in it, and I really think that is a big part of the story. It's a big part of the story for me. The only time that I became really burnt out is when enough things were going on in the team I was working on that were out of my control, that were just kind of killing my ability to be satisfied as a creator. So this is what happens too. So burnout is like, oh, okay, cool, so I'm burnt out. What does that mean? This is what it means. This is from another study. This study has a kind of a funny title. It's like what happens when software developers are unhappy. So these were some of their top respondents, and this was like, I think, a little over 2,000 data points. And it affects it. It affects our ability to problem solve. Our code quality goes down. Our motivation goes down. Every developer I've ever talked to, including myself, like, we're really proud of doing a good job, and we know when we're doing good work. So if we're feeling crappy, we're feeling burnt out, but we still have to produce, we know it's shit. Like, we know we're not doing a good job, and it makes us feel bad. And it's just, it kind of like perpetuates this cycle. So if we're gonna talk about creativity as part of that story, how do we define it? And I thought this would be like an easy question. Like, I went to the research paper expecting a nice little like line of creativity is, and because even in the research, there's not a ton of research focusing just on software developers and what it means and looks like for us, it was a little harder to define. So I started thinking about it, and I was like, well, when I used to get a ton of bug tickets, like, that didn't feel very creative. It actually, I actually would always be the person that would get bug tickets because I was really good at finding them. But then I was like, well, but maybe it is, because finding the bug might not be creative, but figuring out why it happened, figuring out a better way to approach it, and a reason that, like, to implement that, like, this won't end up back in my sprint again. So maybe that's the creative part. Or my very first job was working for a government contractor, so really I maintained products that looked like that at first. I went into legacy code bases a lot and tried to find my way around. And you're really restricted in those places. You'll have comments like, don't touch this code, don't ask us why. And you're just like, okay. And so it's really terrifying. So, but it might be creative to work on those projects. Now you're saying, well, I don't have access to the wide range of modern tools and approaches. I need to figure out how to work within this really constrained area, and that also almost forces you to be more creative. So maybe that's creative. But I really wanted a definition. I can't work on something that I don't understand in a concrete way, right? So the research, the best kind of definition I found was, it's applying novel and innovative solutions based on understanding the context and limitations of existing solutions. And I was like, well, that works pretty well, but let's go back to all the people that I interviewed and get to kind of a more human response to that. And these are some of the quotes that people gave me. And you see a lot of kind of common themes here: experimenting, creating and layering, noticing why things do and do not work, thinking outside the box. This starts to kind of feel like a theme, but again, it's like, it's abstract. It's not like a, how do I work on my creative thinking? How do I know where I'm lacking in this, where I can focus on? So I needed something more than this, because how do I make this actionable? How do I take this idea, if I'm accepting it into my life, that I'm creative and I need creative satisfaction in my work? How do I know if I'm getting it, know if I'm doing the right things to feel that fulfillment in my work? One of the papers I read had this cool visual. I love a research paper with a visual because it gets very boring to read them. So, so it's nice. I saw this graphic and I immediately was like, oh yeah, let's see if I can use this. And this was a cool one. So this is a qualitative study where they interviewed a lot of senior developers from different kinds of places, but there was like a prerequisite you had to have. I think it was like at least something like 8 to 10 years of experience was like the baseline for who they interviewed. And when they went through all of the interviews and all the data, no matter who they talked to, these 7 themes came out. So it came out that being a good software engineer meant that you need to be able to creative problem solve. That was a big core tenet, because they didn't approach it by like what makes a software engineer creative. They kind of approached it by what makes a good software engineer. And creativity came out as a core tenet, creative problem solving, and then from that, these 7 tenets and like these pillars. So I was looking at this for a while and I was like, okay, this is cool. This is kind of getting more towards like an actionable like framework of pieces that we could think about and work on if we want to. But the more I looked at this diagram, the more I didn't like it, because everything's kind of the same in it. Like all of those 7 pillars that they created, this visual gives you the idea that everything is weighted the same. And it also doesn't really tell you what you have control over. What are things in this diagram that I can work on versus things that I have to be aware of, that are outside of my control but are still going to affect my ability to be creative? So in the spirit of creativity, I said, okay, well, let's take this then, and we're going to remix it. We're going to make our own version. So that's what we're going to do next here. So the first thing, I'm a gardener, so we're going to use a gardening analogy here. We have some dirt here. The first thing that I wanted to do was divide the concepts up into personal growth, and then we'll get to external factors. Personal growth is going to be anything that you can control. It doesn't matter where you are, what you're working on, what company you work for, what team you work for. This is all things you can work on no matter what. And with gardening, the first thing you do before you can plant anything is you need to know what your soil quality is. And this is your technical knowledge. You need a base of good soil. You need to be building things. You're reading blogs, you're watching videos, you're taking courses, you might be in a boot camp or a university. You're getting all that technical knowledge. And that's at the beginning of your career. The other thing about it, and also with soil, is you're going to have to treat it in the future. You don't ever stop making sure that you have good soil for your garden. You don't ever stop gaining technical knowledge. So you need this base. So that was missing from the original diagram for me, is I think without the base of technical knowledge, we can't really talk about a lot of the rest of the things you do to become creative. If you are into paint or music, if you don't understand the colors, if you don't understand the paintbrushes, if you don't understand the chords, how can you then create? You need to understand the base tools that you're working with before you can go further. For me, when it really started to dawn on me that being a developer is a creative profession was once I kind of got over that hump of knowledge where I was just panicking all the time and didn't really know what I was doing, I realized I could critically think about problems. And that's when it started to kind of like a light switch flipped for me. The first time I realized this, I started to realize when somebody asked me, can you do this, or can you make this feature, or whatever, I knew right away how I might do it. I also knew pros and cons to doing it multiple different ways. I knew the difference between what a hacky quick fix was to it and what a great solution was. I was able to take all the pieces of technical knowledge I had been pulling together and start to put them together on my own and understand it. And that was like a huge light switch. So these are your bases. And in your soil, when your soil is good, things will start to grow before you even started to plant anything. You'll get volunteers, is like a gardening term, like basically if a bird's flying around and drops seeds, or the wind brings something over. But so if your soil is a hospitable location for that, they'll begin to grow. So your critical thinking starts to grow even naturally as you amass your enough technical knowledge to start to think about problems. So you need this base first, and you're always working on it. Again, we're creating an ecosystem. You're always working on these things. After that, you kind of get to the fun part. This is when you start to plant your actual flowers and make your garden. These are the decisions you get to make. So in this slide, I had put a lot of examples for creative state of mind, techniques, curiosity, communication, but actually what's really cool is I saw all of these here. I don't even need this slide because you all are doing it. Even just by being in this room, you are planting your creativity flowers because you're being inspired by people on stage introducing new ideas. You're being inspired by meeting new people, and you learn about them and what they're building. And you probably already have a lot of ideas already and things that you want to go test and try to build. This is one of the things you can do, is attending conferences. You can also, and Karen mentioned this earlier, she was drawing from psychology, drawing lines from a different profession to ours. You start to be able to see how things line up from other places and get inspired. And that's when you start to really expand. You start to expand your mind out. You start to have opinions. And you start to be able to focus on things outside of just amassing that base knowledge. And the other reason I like to represent this as a garden with flowers, again, it's not equally weighted. You can focus on different things at different times, at different parts of your career. I know some people that are super focused on, building side projects for fun, maybe exploring other languages, and they want to build out from that perspective. Whereas I know other people that are like, I want to shut down my laptop at the end of the week, and I want to go maybe engage in another hobby. And that brings me ideas back and gives my mind freedom for ideas to also like percolate. With the developers that I talked to, I saw two kind of main themes come out of the question. And the question I asked to get these responses is like, what inspires you? And there was a lot of looking at similar kind of hobbies, like architecture, music. Music came up a lot. And actually, I've even met people here. Every time I go to any developer event, I always meet musicians. So there's definitely a link between being a musician and being a developer. And then the other thing is being inspired by other people, which again, you're all doing here now. And then things to clear your mind. So these different themes came up in people that I talked to as well. And you might be doing these already, but if you're not, these are some ideas that you can branch out into and start to expand your mind and grow as a developer, even if you're not necessarily focusing deeply on the tech in the moment. The other side of this is the external factors, the constraints. For these, we're going to represent by the weather. Weather is not inherently good or bad. It is way too hot today. This is a difficult constraint to deal with. We are all very tired. If it was like this for many, many weeks on end, your garden would die unless you watered it a lot. But weather's not inherently good or bad. So for example, some constraints that could be neutral or even good are just having a bounded problem to solve. Maybe not the legacy problem, maybe something different of a boundary, but just having a problem to solve. I don't know how you guys feel about this, but I'm the worst person at just coming up with something to build out of nowhere. Like, I need a problem to solve, and that happens by talking to people or, just reading other things, usually being inspired by things that other people are building. You need a problem to solve. Or maybe it's you're really paying attention and focusing on who are our user base? How are they using things? What are their problems? Maybe it's the amount of time, and for hackathons are notoriously good for creativity, whether internal or external, and they're in a fixed time. And the tools you have to build can also be a neutral or good constraint. Now, another example of that came out of one of my interviews is JD has a really restrictive design system. And I've talked to a few of you here about design systems already and how they affect your ability to work. And there's kind of arguments on both sides of this, of course. For JD, he felt like it was very restrictive. If he has an idea to present, it's got to be, it's run by a committee. So like, if I have an idea I want to share and I know it's got to go through a whole committee, I might be less likely to raise my hand and share it unless I'm really, really sure about it, because that just sounds really exhausting. But for you, you might say that working in a design system actually forces me to really focus in and hone in on how to be creative within that structure. And I actually really enjoy that structure. And so it's not about the constraint being good or bad, but knowing how it affects your ability to create. And then we can get to some that I would say these are going to be negative for most people, but again, it's very personal. Low trust environments where the engineers aren't really allowed to just kind of build. Like, you hire people that are really talented, but then maybe you micromanage them and kind of tell them what to do. Like, that's not a great environment to be in. Failing is punished versus context and education provided. Poor environment to focus. If you're in office, when I was in office, I'm not right now, but I was one of those people that had to put headphones on all day long, whether I was listening to anything or not, because I could not think in an environment that was noisy. It was impossible for me to deeply focus. So there's these other factors that weigh into your ability to be creative, and it's really important to understand how they affect you. And it might be like, well, I can't control any of this. You just said it's external. But knowing what affects you and how is actually really powerful, because it allows you to have the conversations that you need to have to either affect change within your organization, like in your one-to-ones with your manager. If something's not working, hopefully you're in an environment where you could ask for what you needed to be able to perform better. Or if you're looking at new jobs, if you're like, nope, there's way too much bad weather here, I need to leave, you know for the next team what you need by understanding which constraints led you to feel that way. And did it affect your ability to be a creative problem solver? And was that part of the reason? So it does help you make choices that are going to be better for yourself. It also can help you say, you know what? This is the reality of the job. It could be that. And maybe I need to figure out some more creativity flowers to plant. I need to do some more things for myself. For example, JD that I mentioned, he loves his job. He's not happy with the design system, but he fulfills his creative needs elsewhere. And that's good for him. Maybe it wouldn't be good for you. You have to decide. So if you are in a leadership position, I did ask the developers I interviewed, say, what makes leadership be able to have a positive impact on giving developers the space to be creative? And the themes that came out here is, of course, the The team needs to feel comfortable sharing their ideas. Ideas can't be punished. Brian said you have to provide context in issues and PRs. Adam was saying, hire the right people and then get out of their way. So if you are in a position of leadership, how can you foster your team so that they are happier and also more productive? It's better for the company when developers have space to do what they do best. So if we look back at where we started, with the kind of like the creativity spider, I don't know what to call this thing, this is where we ended up. And for me, this kind of works a little better as a framework. We look at the whole ecosystem as a whole. You have to understand that all of this works together, but that there's some things you'll always be in full control of, and other things that you just need to understand. If it's raining too much, or if it's too sunny, do I need to do something different in how I take care of my environment, my garden, my flowers, my soil to deal with it? Or do I need to dig up that garden and move it somewhere else? Like, you can start to realize what you need. And by thinking about yourself as a creative person and a creative problem solver, you can start to look at how you grow as a developer a little bit differently. And ultimately, I just want you all to be inspired and go build cool stuff. And I'm really happy that you were all here today. And I think that you're already doing it. So congratulations to you. If you want to connect with me, that QR code has all my socials. And I'll put these slides up on GitHub, including all the references I used and any links to anybody that I interviewed if you're interested in following them. They're all very interesting people. But thank you so much.